Cool. I'm going to stand over here. Who is this their first YCP event? Hand raise. Okay. Who has been to at least one event? We've got a few. Who's been to every single YCP event so far? We've had 4. Calvin? There's like been 5 or 6. Well, yeah, I know you've been to everyone. Well, okay, cool. Well, we really appreciate it. I have been, this is our second speaker series. We had our first one at NYU, but really we feel debt of gratitude to the 3 West Club. This is 3 of our 4 events have been here. We right next to St. Pat's, and it's a great space. I have been putting off the talk that I'm about to give, so I'm going to talk briefly. As long as we don't, Laura's over there, she's going to record. As long as you don't get in that way, but if you need to get up, use the bathroom, no worries. And then we'll take a brief break, and then Gabe's going to talk. Cool. So I have been putting off the talk that I'm about to give for a significant period of time, just because I wanted to kind of like show and just kind of have that immersive feel of what we're going for with YCP before we do what we're about to do and dissect kind of the inside baseball. So questions that I want to answer in the next, let's call it 10, 20 minutes. What is YCP? How do we apply it? How do we understand it? Why is it so important to our own formation? How do we understand our commitment to God, to the church? Kind of the elephant in the room. How do we, apply broader, political, social, and economic trends? How does that, intersect with us? Who is a young Catholic professional? I get that question a lot. What does YCP offer to your average young professional? The common membership pipelines are the common people that kind of come to us, and then how we fit into the broader New York City ecosystem. And then finally, this is our 4th event, but we're going to do a really quick breakdown of all of our leadership team, our board of directors, and then our 2 chaplains who are unfortunately not here. Sound good? Cool. All right. So when I think about YCP, there's like 4 words that I would love for everyone to walk away with. I got a pointer here. So identity, community, action, and evangelization. And then our patron saint is St. Joseph the Worker, of course. So identity, community, action, evangelization. Try to remember that throughout this talk. Now, I don't know if there's one perfect formula on faith formation, but I've come to kind of understand it as what I call 6+2. We've got studying scripture, you've got catechism, religious education, things we go through either maybe RCIA or Sunday school, our own spiritual formation, spiritual guidance, worship and prayer, receiving the sacraments, and service and outreach. On the bottom, you have joining a community, and you have evangelization. I see the top 6 as things we can all do on our own. Like you have any of these things, whether it's some sort of digital resource or it's you showing up alone, but the bottom is at the group level. And so when we think about YCP, we're thinking about the base of that, those 2 being, what we're here for. The average faith formation. So you've got about 8 domains of formation. How can we understand that? So I work in consulting. These talks are pretty humbling to give. I'm not a theologian at all. I'm not, I don't even know if I took a religion class in college, but so I kind of lean on how I normally communicate, which is through like graphs and slides and stuff. We have this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And we can think about it in our own formation, but Dunning-Kruger is basically saying there's kind of this mental model we go through, this feeling of anytime we try a new skill. So, at first it seems so easy and we get a head steam of confidence. Usually call this beginner's hubris. But then we find ourselves somewhere down here. And then, when we realize whatever it is, maybe we're learning a sport or a language, just how long of a climb we have to go. So when we think about it, when we were kids, you go through Sunday school, you receive your kind of first 3 sacraments. We call this being, catechized, and you're off to the races. But then we find ourselves this feeling of alone and in the valley, and a lot of people stay in the valley. But ideally, you have this S curve, this regression curve that we need to climb. It's hard to climb alone. So we have the 3 people to kind of represent that community feel and this incremental growth, right? We could imagine, let's say that I'm here and your average priest is up here. It's this lifelong journey. It never has completion, right? But that's really what we're trying to seek to. So like I said, after those first 3 sacraments, it's really easy. If I don't do anything more, there's nothing that's going to pull me if I'm just, not willing to kind of go that on my own. But we think community is going to help us climb out. there's a phrase, repetition leads to retention. So we've got our February speaker here, Carl Kilb. He's a law professor, among like 3 other things. But we have this idea, I don't know how he thinks about learning, but you have this learning pyramid, very simple. I'm sure you guys have seen this. But being lectured in a classroom, it really doesn't stick with us. But as we kind of climb down, the more kinesthetics of teaching others, or in this case we'd say evangelization, is really how we can grow, and that's how we're going to deepen our learning. So if I had to put it in very simple terms, very plain terms, YCP is a way of saying that our friends, people at the peer level, can be our best teachers. Here's something, though, if we zoom out a little bit, is anyone in this room a convert to the faith? Like you were the first person in your family to become Catholic, and no other prior generation was Catholic. So we got one over there? 2. Okay, a couple. Not very many, right? So most of us, we would say, we came into the faith before we were born, right? This was a familial decision. But I think it's interesting to think about because this really is the commitment, right? And who along our lineage, whether that was 1,600 years ago or 1,600 whatever, it's kind of interesting to think like how long have my family always been Catholic? Has it been, whatever? So, like I said, in the kind of the theme of frameworks and toolkits and whatnot, we have this theme of Perry's scheme of cognitive development. Has anyone heard of this before? No. Okay. This is basically what an average higher ed college should do to a student. So you start out, you have a very dualistic view. This is saying it's either one or the other. So let's imagine we're in college. I can either do a hard major or an easy major. I'm either going to be rich or I'm going to be poor. I'm going to have fun or I'm going to be miserable, right? That's a very kind of one or the other way of thinking. And then as we go through this idea of multiplicity, and that it's not quite that easy. Very few things are actually A or B. There's usually A, B, C, D, E, F, right? And then there's a sense of relativism and the fact that, okay, there's even more than I thought, but what does that really matter? How do I relate that to myself? And then this final feeling of commitment, which we want to kind of glean towards, is saying, among all of the religions, among all of the career vocation, here's what I am committing myself to. It's an individual thing, and a phrase I like, it's a long obedience in the same direction. That's how we can think about commitment. So like I said, if we think about it from a student level, going from that open option, the freshman, to the undergrad or the person who's just about to graduate into a very specific role. When we think about our speaker tonight, our speaker in February, and we think about the saints and all the people before us, I really go back to the phrase that I think biography is our central teacher. When we think about St. Augustine, his conversion, his formation to the faith follows Perry's scheme almost to a T. He starts out life in a very dualistically, he's a Manichaean, good versus evil, and that's kind of where it stops. He has this idea of multiplicity. I think it's in Confessions. He intellectually recognizes God, but he's bonded to sin. He's basically saying, I'm not ready yet. And then relativism, he has the famous conversion scene in the garden. He hears the phrase, take up and read. And this is really what is kind of the genesis of his own formation. And then we see a commitment and a lifelong obedience to the church, and it ends in sainthood. So the commitments, we can say that commitments form our identity. We can prioritize other things, but when we think about our time and the stages of life, they kind of fall into these 6 or 7 commitments. You have, your probably first commitment is the one that was made for you. It's your family commitment. For a lot of us, the one that's also made for us is our faith commitment. But a 6-year-old's not thinking about philanthropy. So we can kind of see that each of these are staggered. And the one that most of you have made the most recently is probably career and vocation commitments. And then maybe it's personal self-commitments, commitments to another. But this is how we kind of form it. This would be the 7 or 8 ones that form our identity. But how do we see this over time? There was a psychologist, his name was Erik Erikson, and he said there's 8 stages of our own development. And I was just talking with somebody about this, but really we're not really conscious of the first 4 stages. It's really on our parents to say, how am I going to guide the child through each of these stages? Because what ends up happening is if we don't successfully navigate each of these stages, then we're stuck, right? We experience, I know it says here stagnation, but we experience this stagnation. If you heard the phrase failure to launch, it can kind of be traced back to one of these. So we see from 0 to 1.5 years, trust versus mistrust towards the parents, autonomy versus shame and guilt, initiative versus guilt, And then you have what's really kind of kindergarten through about middle school, a sense of industry and inferiority. So you have a lot of homework. How can they really be an enterprising and industrial person? Here's one that's probably the most interesting, and you'll notice that the conversation is not necessarily being directed at you as much as it is high school kids or college kids. It's the idea of identity versus role confusion. I would say in the best sense, what the secular world probably does is say your identity is based on your career. Everything else is just kind of tertiary. But I would say probably most recently you have things where the political sphere comes in, you have gender, you have sexuality, like identity becomes a really focal point more at that age, and I feel like the conversation just continues to get bigger. For us though, YCP explicitly is 22 to 39, right? We give or take in some direction, but what do we see here, right? We're talking about community, having a sense of bond, intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy versus isolation, right? Erickson did this in like the 80s, so I don't think, intimacy in that sense was probably, how do we have intimacy with our community, with our people, with our work? How do we really have this shared connection, the shared bond? I would say in probably the last however many years, we live in one of the most lonely cities on earth. More people are living alone than ever before, more people are unwed than ever before. Generally, we're trending towards isolation. Now, what's interesting, I was talking with Bob Stone about this, the Lumen Institute, right? We have the fellows who are 22 to 39, and then 40 to 65. This new stage, this next stage that we want to leave people, or we want to kind of catapult people into. Generativity versus stagnation. You've built 40 years of your life, you've built a career, how do you give back? You have a family life, how do you give back? How do you raise up the next generation? If you don't really navigate that, or you don't really navigate a sense of intimacy, then we have this sense of stagnation. And then the last phase of ego integrity versus despair. Did I lead a full life? Did I do what I was called to? Did I follow the commandments? Or is it really a sense of regret? So, for us right here, identity, we want to subvert back to saying your core identity is that you're a Catholic, right? That's why, we're not calling out that this person has that big job and this person does that, or this person is only XYZ. That really doesn't apply, right? When you walk in here, your core focus is that we're all Catholic. What I didn't mention, and what seems like it's just dominated the public sphere, whether we liked it or not in the last 6 years, is how basically our political value system and our politicians have subverted everything to say that that's more important than our religious identity. It's not lost on me that 3 of the 4 of my events, so I was also asking, Bob's like, what is this place? And I said, this is nominally known as the Women's National Republican Club, right? So it has a political leaning, but it still puts on all these weddings and it advertises itself as pretty secular. For me though, we have this explicit rule within this ministry at least to remain non-political. It's really the only industry we can't feature, and we can't, especially if somebody's running for office or ran for office, you just can't trust anyone that is in that sphere to come up here and give an unbiased talk and give that wholesome talk without it having some agenda behind it. So all to say, we're not trying to convert anyone one direction. I think this is interesting, and I don't know, the census data is so interesting, like why they segment by race and all that. But you have Catholic and white Catholic. I don't know why they do that. But Catholic in general, we see a 49-50 split, right? Clear, it wasn't that we were one way or the other. And then white Catholic, you see a little bit, but again, I don't know why they did that either. But again, we're holding these events here, and we're so close to St. Pat's, and it just becomes a great deal just to do it here. So our next event, though, is at NYU, but nothing we're doing is trying to be one way or the other, but if it comes down to saying, are we openly pro-life or pro-choice? We're obviously openly pro-life, so we're not embracing any sort of progressivism. I'm just going to be clear on that. It's interesting to look, at the world through this lens of what's been more dominating, right? Religion versus politics. Christmas Eve in New York, 1956. And remember 1956, right? That's the end of the first 60 years of the 20th century. We see in some sort of unified way, all the crosses, and to my knowledge, no outrage over this. 60 years later, was Mother Teresa a cult leader by the New York Times? Right, to say that it's openly okay to, a lot of anti-Catholic rhetoric, this is acceptable, that we didn't stop what we were doing to do this, and there's only about 100,000 more examples of something like this. in the modern day. So we say the world has turned. The way that we describe this is using a political phrase, which is a shift in the Overton window of how do, when we look at it left, right, or center, what is politically, socially, culturally acceptable in the current moment. In 2021, it was socially acceptable to criticize and sort of, be self-critical of the Catholic Church. 60 years prior, not the case. So there was does anyone work in political science or politics at all? Before I continue, okay. So there was a guy, Samuel Huntington, really famous political scientist of the 20th century. I think he was a professor at Harvard. But he had a book called American Politics, and this was 1981. He says, every 60 years, America experiences what we could, in general, call a moral convulsion. He calls a paroxysm of creedal passion, which is kind of a highbrow way of saying a moral convulsion. The world, every 60 years, you have 3 generations. We sort of realized that the old way is not working. We needed to find a new way. And what's interesting in this is, as he defines it, they basically line up with our industrial revolutions. So the most recent one up to 1981 was in the 60s, and we'll talk about that next. But in 1981, he said, the next convulsion, the next real big dissident in America is going to be 2020. And if you go on to read it, it's actually pretty accurate, which is almost shocking. But what I like what he said is, at the time, his most famous book, 15 years later, he said it was called Clash of Civilizations. He says the most important aspect of civilization is their culture, and the culture is defined by religion. So this is a complete oversimplification of the last 120 years, but let's look at what we call the last 2 moral convulsions. It's interesting to think of it being in New York. We have this immigrant ethos, right? Coming to America, Western migration patterns from Europe. We had our First World War, the boom and bust of the 20s. You had the Great Depression, the Second World War, and the post-war economic boom of the 50s. Macro behaviors, collectivism, group orientation, dense communities, a lot of ethnic nationalism and segregation, just as a result of those migration patterns. A strong family unit, right? In 1914, a 12-year-old was reliant on the child to be economically productive. We have a sense of shared resources, goes back to dense communities, and a trust of big institutions. The micro behavior, I think, was typified in the 1961, kind of the end of that first convulsion, was what is life asking for me? It was a sense of self-effacement. We've just been through 2 wars. We've been through the Great Depression. It's quite a lot to live for, but you're inculcated by all those macro events. You have a sense of vocation. You have a sense of humility, deference to authority. But really, the big problem was a sense of conformity. There was very little individualism. You weren't really seeing yourself as saying, well, I'm a Korean American woman, but I'm also 100 other things. You can't lump me in this group. So around the same time of JFK's first inaugural, when he says that phrase, ask not what your country wants from you, but what your country's asking of you, you have the Port Huron Statement. And the Port Huron Statement is basically a bunch of college kids in Port Huron, Michigan, saying, all this stuff, okay, some of it worked, but a lot of it didn't. And we need to have exactly what Huntington calls was a moral convulsion. We need to completely think of things in kind of a reversion to some other side. So the 60s, we have the Civil Rights Movement, you have the Pride March, you have fourth wave feminism, I believe, but you just have what they called the radical 60s, right? It was the blowing up of the social order. And a lot of people thought that this was America saying, all right, we're ready to move to complete progressive ideology. In 1972, you have the most lopsided victory. Richard Nixon wins, I think, 49-1. So in a macro sense, the community said, or the country said, we're not quite ready. But really what sprung from that in the early 1970s on, was the idea of that we are individuals and we have this great entrepreneurial spirit, and so much of that 1970 to 2020 innovation would not have happened without a sense of kind of breaking part in the 60s. Macro behaviors we saw, hyper-individualism, cultural pluralism. We had suburbs and urban hotels, deep amounts of consumerism, which I'll talk about in a second. You had modern affluence, economies of scale. Suddenly a lot of things get a lot easier. And you have utilitarianism. I think this starts to weigh in where it was more about how do we measure our self-worth is our economic output. The micro behavior, though, is now hyper-individualism. What do I want from life, right? What is these are more of self, it's a sense of self-advancement, self-aggrandizing, and it was about my own indulgences. Trust the self, we had a lot of rebellion, and then what is kind of our core sin of this was deep amounts of narcissism. You had reversions, you had a lack of trust in big institutions, and as we'll see, we had increasing climbs in atheism. For the first time, consumption and exports, consumption and imports are outweighed by our own production. We start to overconsume personally and as a country, but all these things say that we need to please the self before we produce. In the last, up to this, the last 20 years of that moral convulsion, we see a great rise, and this is census data, in unaffiliation. So in 1986, 10% of people under 30 said, I have no religion, I have no identification. By 2016, 20 years later, or 30 years later, it was 38%, right? So almost 40% are now saying, I don't need God, I don't need a religion, I see myself as kind of the highest authority, and then we saw pretty consistencies between 2016 and 2020. The lost sheep, so the interesting thing here, I know you can't see this, but we have Catholics are this third one, and the most, and then this purple one is unaffiliated. So the most popular religion for 18 to 64 is unaffiliated. Agnosticism, atheism, whatever it is. Religion is not a part of their lives. And that's still a pretty high number for the 65 plus crowd, which you would say is probably a little more traditional in their ways. And then only 8% of 18 to 29-year-olds. So what does this mean? How do we think about this in a broader sense? Right? We've talked about formation. You've talked about how we've all related to this broader commitment, this lifelong deep commitment to Catholicism. But what we've seen is a lot of people falling away. And we can think of it in a distribution curve of really 4 buckets. One, surprise, surprise, you guys are in this first bucket. Practicing Catholics, you're living your faith, outwardly Catholic, unapologetically Catholic. The second bucket, what we would call cultural Catholics. They're, Creaster Catholics, they're showing up a couple times, they're not really against it, but they're not really practicing. This third bucket is what we call maybe a lapsed Catholic or fallen away Catholic. And you remember the feeling of falling away, and you're just outwardly, you're about to reject something, you can't really articulate why, it's more of a feeling. That's how we would think about someone who is really pulled away entirely. And then the atheists, or maybe someone who's potentially going to convert, they're in this fourth bucket. They can actively talk and say, here's all the reasons God's not real, here's the reason I'm atheist. In any sense, though, every single person in this sphere is still Catholic. Whether they are, remember, go back to the formation curve, there are different parts of the formation curve. What our hope with YCP is that you have these events, everyone is welcome. There is no such thing as it's the opposite of exclusive. There's no levels of you have to be this good of a Catholic or you haven't been to Mass in 15 years. We really do want everybody to come through our halls. That would be, I think, the best result, and I think the best takeaway is to say, when you have those people in your life who say the phrase like, oh man, I'm not even going to say it, they'll fall in one of these 2 buckets, that's the exact place I'd want you to bring them, is an event like this. Maybe they're not ready to go to Mass, they're not ready to even talk to a priest, but going back, our best teacher is our friend, right? The final phase of moral formation happens at the peer level. So, you build this big, broad, opt-in community of Catholics, and then suddenly something like YCP helps them climb this curve. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, so now how can we think about America's 5th moral convulsion, right? If Huntington said 2020, which, tell me if I'm wrong, but felt like its own moral convulsion, we now needed to kind of decide and define what do the next 60 years look like, right? It's just like somebody who was 30 years old in the 1960s, who led those movements, and what did they say was important? The way that I see it, so we've talked about a few concepts, right? Production versus consumption, and as Huntington says, religion versus this rise in secularism. If you think of it as a Cartesian plane, where we want to be is leading towards religion, leading towards Catholicism, and having sort of a production mindset. The general thesis, I think for us, being here in New York, YCP, this big 30 chapter network, building structure, process, routine, and most importantly, community around God and our own formation. So how does YCP fit into that? Now going back, everybody, like what is YCP? When I say everybody, young, 22 to 40, a little older, that's okay. Catholic, it is, I mean, this is the broadest sense of you're even interested to learn about Catholicism. Like I really open the doors to absolutely everybody, but especially those people in your life, those people at work, those people you see that are, they're just kind of wrestling with it, but they're not sure why, right? They're kind of like ready for an argument. They're ready to kind of talk about it. Those people end up having the strongest conversion stories and end up being some of the most just well-formed people. So not being afraid of those, just saying, hey, maybe think about YCP. And professional, this is probably the most misinterpreted word. We say professional to give dignity to our work. It is not that we're all white-collar professionals. If you're a plumber or you work at Starbucks or you're unemployed, everyone's a professional, right? This is just saying that, we've got Carl Kilb and his son here. Carl goes to NYU. So when he graduates, we'll welcome Carl in. But right now he has, campus ministry that he can get into. So we would just say, unless you're outside of the family, kind of in that rare niche of like, you're 20, but you're not in college, but you're maybe, a plumber or something like that, those folks are welcomed in. But if you're out of college, we would say, join us when you graduate. Now, like I said, the lifelong, we have this big rise in unaffiliated and atheism. So where does YCP come in? You have people that leave the home in high school, leave college, and it's open seas, right? Is God and going to church and all this stuff the first thing on your mind? A lot of that's probably predicated by your parents or environment or something, but I'm pretty sure unless you're going to maybe even something like Notre Dame, their identity formation is not so much around religion. That's how I understand colleges now. But we want to grab them as soon as they graduate, whether that's 20 or 22, and we want to be the landing place. We want to be the bridge between you and eventually, the family unit. Our core programming, so, last month we had our Advent party, networking happy hours. We'll try to do 3 or 4 a year. What's tonight and what'll be in February, executive speaker series, just executives talking in very comfortable terms, what it's like to navigate a big career and hold on to your faith. And then we do these once a year, but St. Joseph Saturdays, it'll be March 4th, just a half-day Saturday retreat. Going deeper, you've got executive mentorship, you've got forums, panel discussions, a spiritual hotline, and then we have a conference, which I'll be at, a few of us will be at, but it's like 600 or 700 young Catholics in Dallas, Texas, which is where YCP started. Now, a lot of people have, a few other questions I've gotten is being like, what, it should be else. It should be something else. Like YCP should be, where are the Bible studies? Where are all these other things? And I think another thing I'd love everyone to walk away with is this idea of transactional ministries versus transformational ministries. YCP will always be a transactional ministry. What does that mean? We want to lead people to other ministries. We want to pull that person in, like I said, who's atheist or who's goes to daily mass but just doesn't have any Catholic friends. You're building community around that. But ideally, there's probably some other interest or there's some other path in your formation that already exists within New York. And you're saying, you work in finance, send you to the Catholic Finance Association. You go to that church, here's their young adult group. So we're always playing basically recruiter and send them to the next ministry. Some of the ones, so we've got Bob Stone here, who's one of the founders of the Lumen Institute. Right above us is actually, Legatus is having their monthly speaker series. I know, who here is in Leonine Forum? A couple of you guys? Okay. So Leonine Forum, you've got Opus Dei, and you've got about 50 or 60 others. These are examples of transformational ministry, right? The cohort, small group discussion, scripture reading, all those things where you're really going to grow. Okay, membership pipelines. So just to put a visual around it, we have people who just graduated. You have active people. Like I said, some of you guys, this is your first event. Has anyone here ever been to a YCP event in another city? Okay, hands low, like 6 or 7. All right. So YCP members that's how a lot of people are going to find, right? There's only one Catholic NYC. In most other cities, let's say Atlanta or Nashville, there's not an equivalent to like someone like Colin or Caitlin. So YCP is kind of the first landing spot. But we want to pull all those folks in and then send them to all these groups, right? Transactional, transformational. the member pipeline. So let's say, for instance, I moved to Houston. I got some note from the Newman Center or my own campus ministry. Hey, join YCP as you move to a new city. In my mid-20s, I moved to Chicago, and then I am growing into the family life, and there's YCP Detroit. Something, just an example of someone who's constantly moving around. You just want that inborn network to say, where can I find my people? Where can I find the group of Catholics? From campus ministry, someone like our friend young Carl, there's Focus, there's, like I said, the Newman Center. There's all these ways, right? But we want to, in probably August, we'll do some sort of welcome to the city panel. It'll be specifically new grads, but this is obviously a big pipeline for us. So Father Isaiah is one of our chaplains. We explicitly made sure Father Isaiah was our chaplain because we want those folks from NYU to come to that event after they graduate. And then kind of the big one, the reverts coming back to church, the converts coming to church. I like this idea of shallow waters. YCP is a metaphor of shallow waters because something like this, you'll come listen to Gabe, who's an executive at TikTok. Like that's an easy event to get somebody to go to. But eventually, we want to, like I said, send them to something, send them to deeper water, send them to more transformational stuff. Our future in the tri-state area. So the actual first chapter to launch was Fairfield County. I don't know, where's Tom? We've got somebody there. So Tom's a leader with the Fairfield County. This is the Diocese of Bridgeport. We launched last October, so we represent Manhattan, basically from Staten Island up to Hudson Valley. And then what's launching in a couple months will be YCP New Jersey, very exciting. So that's Newark, Patterson, Metuchen. And then we're actually going to launch 2 chapters, but YCP Brooklyn and YCP Queens. That was not our choice, but Bishop Brennan, actually, they said the diocese is going to front the money. So ideally, by the end of the year, we'll launch either one or both of those. And then Long Island, we'll probably launch in 2024. So you've got 6 chapters, but again, this is one of the most dense concentrations of Catholics. I think the top 8 of 10 states with the most Catholics is basically just the Acelia corridor. It's just all the states in the Northeast. Okay, that was a lot. Before, I want to introduce, again, this is not just me. I know I'm inadvertently the face, and it was kind of the opposite thing I wanted to do, which was I wanted to be the guy behind the scenes and lift everybody up, and now I'm doing more talking than I care to. But I want to acknowledge all the people who make everything possible. It's about 30 of us. I'm going to go real quick. So chaplains, like I said, Father Isaiah, he's on his first assignment from the ministry at St. Joe's. He's from the Dominican Order. Father Peter Martyr, does anyone go to St. Vincent Fair? So Father Peter has been with me since mid-2021, which is when we were just getting started. And then Father Daniel Ray is another one of our chaplains. He lives in Rye, and he's with the Legion of Christ. Our board of directors, so all these events, as much as I love the Three West Club, they'd still charge us. So these are things we need to fundraise for. We have our board members, and then we try to fundraise other ways. Bill Beards, he is a trustee at St. Joe's. We've got Chris. Where's Chris? There's Chris over there. I'm not going to try. Musielak? Musielak. Okay, right. Chris works at Google, machine learning engineer. John Malizia, CEO of a company called A1 Roofing, lives in Long Island. John Malvisi, retired audit partner at Deloitte, lives in Westchester. Our board chairman is a guy named Mario Bruschi. He goes to Mass at St. Pat's. He does not have the same job as John Malvisi. He works in healthcare. Phil Castoro. Phil's hiring, if you need to know. He's the owner of an analytics company. You've got Chris. Where's Chris? There's Chris. Chris Canson. Riveron. Edwina Yo. Who's here from Super Momos? Awesome. Okay, so is Edwina here? She's coming. Okay. Well, she's missing her moment. Edwina's the co-founder of something similar. So Edwina actually reached out. She moved to New York like May 1st, and on May 2nd, she reached out to NYU. Like she does all this community building for all things technology as well as religion. She runs something also called Catholic Catches. Gene Zanetti. Gene was our first speaker. He's a motivational speaker, champion wrestler. We just showed you, Edwina. You missed the starting moment. Gene Zanetti. Gene was our first speaker, total superstar. JP Michaela. JP works for Alibaba. He leads Juventutum, which is like YCP, but specifically for Latin Mass. Kevin June works in venture capital. Louis Puna, is Louis here? No? Luis works in construction. And then our chapter leadership team. Audrey Kaplan. Audrey is our co-director of outreach. So, right, there's a ton of ministries, all those folks we want to send people to. She's a co-director, works in, she's an auditor of PwC. Also Bill Beards. Bill is the son of William Beards. He's our director of technology. He works at, he has an app called Castanet. Brittany Franco, Brittany's here. Co-director of membership. She works as a market data associate. Jeff Vargas, where's Jeff? Jeff's at the end. Jeff's co-director of membership, works for the NYPD. Love law enforcement. Killian, co-director of operations, also works at PwC. Kelly Brady, where's Kelly? Oh, there's Kelly. They're all sitting in a row, like I told them. Co-director of outreach, works in Deloitte. Laura Allen. Laura is our videographer, works for herself, and is just amazing. Matthew Smith is our photographer. Matthew lives on Long Island, works for himself as well. Rose O'Neill. Where's Rose? There's Rose in the back. Rose is our director of evangelization, and she works for the Metropolitan Opera. Sixto is our finance director, and Taylor is our co-director of operations. So I say that to say this. YCP boards turn over each year, so as things stand out to you, we're also standing up, like I said, YCP Brooklyn and Queens, but we need a room full of leaders. We really can't afford to have it be a few of us and a lot of us. We really, if you feel like you're called to something like this, or maybe it's something else, then be sure to let us know. Okay, events and next steps, and then this is my last slide. So our February executive speaker, Mr. Carl Kilb, will be at NYU Catholic Center on the 15th, the day after Valentine's Day. And then we have our St. Joseph Saturday. That'll be at St. Joe's, just to be ironic. YCP New Jersey is set to launch probably March, April. And then the YCP National Conference will be in Dallas in late April, a few weeks after Easter. And then we'll do some speaker series, and we have plenty of happy hours over the summer. My asks from you. We have a membership. It's not that much, but what it does is a few things. One, there are some like added benefits. But when you feel, it's kind of like a gym, right? You pay a little bit, it's $3 a month, but even just a little bit gets you to be like, I'm paying for that, I should probably go to that. Gets people involved, and then how many people have family or parents that live outside of New York or the tri-state? Like you go home to like Ohio or something over the weekend. Okay, a few of you guys. There's likely at this point, there's likely a YCP chapter in that given city or that given region, and what they've found is as people join this feeling of a national network, they go to those events, or they find out, like, hey, I'm from Detroit, what's going on in Detroit? So suddenly that was an afterthought, and now you're actually a little curious. So joining that is a big help. Bring a friend. Like I said, it has no qualification around that. Just bring anyone who maybe wouldn't normally go to an event like this. Following us on social media, engaging with other Catholics. So if you work with other Catholics, we want to build out this great list of speakers. Think of a point where you have 5 YCP chapters. That's a lot of speakers. That's a lot of folks we need to be interested and excited. And then if nothing else, you can just pray for our ministry. But I really appreciate you guys listening. We've got Gabe as our next speaker. Let's take like a 5-minute break, and I really appreciate you guys being here. But we'll pick back up in 5 minutes. So, thanks.